Hello, this is my review of the Racing ZMT-10 or the Turnigy Stadium King two-wheel drive Truggy. Now, I've had this truck for a little over a year now, and I've had a little bit of a hard time trying to do a review on it. I've tried several times, and every time it ends up kind of a bubbly mess. But to kind of try to simplify things, I'm going to start this off answering probably the number one question that surrounds this truck, and probably the whole reason why you're watching this, and that is this a good beginner vehicle? Is it something that I would feel comfortable recommending to somebody who is new to the RC hobby? Now, I have to be quite blunt, I really don't recommend this. I wouldn't have any issues recommending it as a second or a third vehicle in your lineup, but I wouldn't really recommend this as a first, namely because by the time you get done addressing all the flaws with this, you're probably going to have as much invested in it as you are with most of the other brand name vehicles that are out there, or bigger brand names. And to be quite honest, it's a lot of work, and I really don't think that I could recommend that to somebody who's a beginner. I normally try to recommend the least complicated vehicle possible as far as maintenance and what actually needs to be done to it in the very beginning. Now, I will say that to me, I think this offers a good bang for buck for somebody who is a little bit more experienced and has the intentions of customizing the vehicle, because that does kind of offset the negatives about this a little bit. Now, one of the negatives about this is the body. The body is made out of PVC. It's not very durable. Once this material actually flexes too far past its forgiving point, it snaps. It doesn't continue to flex or just kind of bend into that position, like the more commonly used Lexan. So a beginner who normally wrecks and damages bodies quite often is normally going to have to replace this pretty early on in their in the lifespan of this vehicle. So I really wouldn't want to recommend it, because you're looking at another 30, 40 bucks after paint and everything to replace this body and to keep your vehicle looking nice. Alright, and that's kind of offsets the cost a good chunk, whereas most of the better quality brand name stuff normally comes with a Lexan body that can take a lot of abuse and still look halfway decent at least a 10-foot distance. So I kind of have that problem with it. One of the other areas is the wheels. They appear to be made out of an ABS type plastic and are really too thin to be made out of that type of material, and they break and chip quite easily. The front ones on this are heavily cracked from collisions, and the outer diameter of this one has pretty much been chewed away. Hopefully you can see the majority of it's missing, and a very rough outer diameter there off the face due to jumping and just other random running around. And it doesn't really help that these are a low profile tire, as this does use 2.8-inch rims. Sadly, it doesn't use the same style bead as the Traxxas 2.8 rims. So I'm not really sure of a good replacement wheel source where you can keep the stock tires, which is really a shame, because the stock tires are actually pretty good quality in my opinion. They're probably one of the best compounds I've run into on a ready to run. And it actually is quite tacky if the tires kept nice and clean. The foam inserts are a bit stiff when you first receive the vehicle, but after a few, probably 2 battery packs or so, they start to soften up and they hit that perfect spot probably about the 3rd pack. And they actually stay in that stiffness range for quite a while. And sadly though, they probably will wear out before the actual tires do, as long as you keep it on a off-road surface. One of the other areas as far as maintenance and work on this, it does actually need quite a bit of work out of the box really to be a precision vehicle. That's the best way I can really say that. The steering has a decent bit of slop in it, and it can be centered around a couple of areas. The steering link that runs from the servo horn to the bell crank system, I really don't think they put any effort in designing and figuring out how to do that at all. It has an insane amount of slop in it, and it is amazing how much of a difference it makes just changing that part over to an adjustable link with ball ends. The bell crank system itself has a little bit of slop in it, but it's normally not going to be enough for a beginner to notice, or, well, unless you're racing where you're actually going to need that precision. that could be offered by properly shimming that. Now the servo saver can be extremely annoying because it likes to loosen itself up under use, and that's pretty easy to remedy by installing a washer on part of the chassis and then as a spacer, and then using a O-ring to apply gentle pressure to that nut so that it can't self-rotate. Alright, and it's not that big of an issue in reality. It just takes disassembly and just a little bit of knowledge to be able to get the parts required. The transmission, on the other hand, is a bit more of a hassle. They decided to use bushings on this instead of bearings, which is the now commonplace thing to do. I pretty much recommend installing bearings absolutely as soon as possible, but you're also going to need to order a set of 5mm shims to be able to shim the transmission. Due to inaccurate manufacturing procedures, there is a pretty good variance in these, and so they're not a really tight fit and you get a lot of side-to-side play. Shimming it does help a lot and should prolong the gear life by a good margin. The differential on this also wasn't shimmed from the factory, and there's a lot of gear play in the bevel gears. So I highly recommend shimming the bevel gears and the differential also. And I have a write-up about that and the steering on my blog, and I also did a short video on the transmission that should be available here on YouTube if you go to my channel and follow it somewhat. Another area that's going to require some work is the shocks. They weren't manufactured or assembled quite to the precisions of most of the other big names. Mine didn't really have any issues with flash or anything like that with the pistons causing binding. The main issue with mine was actually a lack of lubrication on the O-rings. Normally when the bigger names assemble their shocks, they normally use a silicone grease, or at least recommend it during assembly, to provide prolonged lubrication and to allow the seals to move a little bit, and also it lubricates the shaft a little bit. I believe on these all they did was just assemble it. They may have used a little bit of silicone oil, but to be frank, it's not enough, and it does cause a symptom sometimes referred to as stiction, which is a play off of static friction and stuck, where the shock wants to stay in position with an abnormal amount of strength. Once normally you actually extend and compress the shock, it's normally fine for a little while, but generally it tries to do it again later on down the road. Probably the next most negative thing about this is the steering servo. The steering servo is actually pretty low quality, even by ready-to-run standards. Most ready-to-run kits come with a standard servo that is kind of weak, not really all that fast, but they're normally pretty reliable. This one that this comes with is pretty unreliable. It has a lot of play in the gears. It won't center quite right, and it leads to a lot of play in it, and that's probably actually the #2 greatest point of play in the steering system once you buy this, if you buy this kit. Replacing the servo is not really a big deal, but it is an additional cost, and you're probably going to be looking at about a $15 range cost for a replacement servo. I would probably say that those are all the #1 problems with this. I've been quite happy actually with the durability of the plastic components in this. I haven't broken any components except for one, and that was the front bulkhead that actually holds the control arms and such. I broke mine rather early, but I was abusing this quite heavily, and really the way it broke, I'm not sure if it's a design flaw or if it was a manufacturing flaw where the process of molding the piece wasn't done quite correctly, or what the deal was. The rest of the plastic seems very durable. The only other component that I really actually broke was a body mount, and really I'm not that surprised. It extended quite a bit up, and it had to flex quite a bit in several wrecks that it was done, or this was put through, so I kind of understand that pretty well. I'd say one of the other slight downsides to this is the fact that it will not accept a 7-cell battery pack. The battery tray is just short enough that it won't, but it's not tight enough that a 6-cell pack fits tight, or a LiPo that is in the normal length range fits tight. Really, it needs a battery spacer to go along with it, a spongy type material to go in there to help take up some of the room so you don't have that movement and have excess wear on your battery case, and I suppose somewhat on the chassis. One area that I was also really impressed with was the dog bone and drive cups on the differential and on the axle shaft. They've held up very well. They've barely worn. You can tell they have been used, but they're not really worn to the point that a lot of vehicles I've seen do this, especially some of the brand name vehicles have had issues with this, and I'm really impressed by them. One downside to the shocks on this is if you do decide that you want to try to tune them, shock springs are a little hard to get a hold of. They're kind of in a goofy size range. They're not exactly the same size as most of the other big bore shocks currently used in 1/10 scale. They're actually essentially 1/8 scale big bores, or the equivalent of what's normally used in 1/8 scale, and it kind of makes the spring rates a little bit hard to figure out. The stock springs are a little stiff, but after a little bit of use they kind of break in and work perfectly. I was very actually impressed with the settings after the springs broke in and the shocks were properly lubricated in the O-rings. Now, as far as the electronics equipment, the motor is a little bit of a disappointment, but not really. I think it is a proper range for a beginner, but it's also a little bit slow for anybody else who's been involved in the hobby. I believe it's a 20-turn motor. It seems to be about where the performance is. Sadly, the vehicle's also really over-geared out of the box, and I really would heavily recommend a 22-tooth pinion, okay, as a good starting point. I've had really good luck with that. If you are in a really high temperature climate where you're going to be in 100-degree plus weather, I would recommend dipping down lower than that and doing your own experimentations with checking temperatures and trying different size pinions. I did find that the top speed is not actually reduced very much by dropping down to a 22-tooth pinion from the stock 25. I blame this mostly on mechanical resistance and such, as the motor, it doesn't really have the power to be able to spool itself up to its peak RPM with that gearing. And that was kind of a little bit of a disappointment. The motor also takes an exceptionally long time to break in, which should mean that the brushes should last an exceptionally long amount of time, which is a good thing, especially if you like the vehicle stock and you're not planning on doing a lot of upgrading. Now, the ESC, I did complain a little bit at the very beginning when I received it due to the fact that it doesn't look very finished. It looks kind of hashed together, to be quite honest, and I still maintain that it doesn't look very good, and I don't really care for it in that manner. But I have been pleasantly surprised by it. Reportedly, it was supposed to have a 300 amp burst rating and be rated somewhere around 50 constant, somewhere between 40 and 50 constant. I do believe these specs, and I was using this in the vehicle with a 15-turn brush motor with reasonable gearing and had absolutely no issues as far as temps, and it seemed to do really well. Currently, it is now in this clodbuster here that belongs to my wife, and it has been used in it for several months now since I switched this over to brushless and was running it in brushless form. And in that application, it's running twin 27-turn brush motors, sealed can, stock Tamiya motors of the 540 variety. Now, one interesting little tidbit that I came up with just out of boredom was I tried to plug in a 3S LiPo just to see what would happen. Interestingly enough, the chimes at the beginning of Power Up actually registered that it was a 3S LiPo. The chimes changed. So apparently the voltage cutoff is programmed to be able to deal with a 3S LiPo. Whether the rest of the ESC is actually capable of dealing with it long term, I'm not going to really swear to it. I have run the clodbuster with a 3S LiPo and experienced reasonable temperatures, so I do believe that it is entirely possible that in a 1/10 scale vehicle you should have a very nasty brushed ESC on your hands if it can survive long. My main concern would actually be with the BEC not being able to deal with it for long term. But in the case of this clodbuster, it draws quite a bit of amperage out of the BEC to operate the steering servo, and I was really only reading somewhere between 130 to 140 with the stock gearing and everything on 3S after about a 10-minute run. So I think that it does have the possibility of being a good long-term ESC if you want to run 3S LiPo and moderate motors. I will say that It's still in the black area, so it's at your own risk if you decide to try this. Another thing that really I like about this is the transmitter and receiver. I really like both of them. I've had good luck with both of them. I've had some of these with other vehicles that I've purchased that were ZD Racing or by ZD Racing, and I have yet to have a real problem with them. The only real complaint I have about the radio system is the fact that the battery holder does not have a retention system to hold it in place in the bottom of the radio. So if you don't have the lower cover on and decide to pick up the radio, the battery holder and the batteries all yank on the power wire, which is wired directly to the circuit board. And being that it's a thin gauge and it's attached to the circuit board, it does make me a bit paranoid, so I did or do normally put double-sided tape on the underside to help retain it into the casing, and I do recommend that. It is a 3-channel radio. It's 2.4 gigahertz, and I've had exceptionally good luck with them. I also do have a video covering that on my YouTube channel, talking about the 2 different versions that I've received from ZD Racing, and you can watch it if you want a few more details on it. I was actually kind of pleasantly surprised with the nickel metal hydride. I thought I received a pretty piddly one, as I have had bad luck with some nickel metal hydrides coming out of China being very low quality, not keeping up with their ratings. And to be quite honest, this one's kept up quite well. It does meet or exceed its ratings by a reasonable margin, and it did take a couple of charges for this to actually wake up, but it did wake up, and it does work excellently now. I'd say I've covered just about everything I've got to say on this. Once again, I don't have a problem with it as a truck. I like it for myself. I'm not sure necessarily who I would recommend it to, other than somebody who wants a backup basher or a loaner, if you will, to loan to somebody. And that's probably the #1 void this fills. It's a cheap vehicle that a experienced hobbyist could work on and keep running very easily, and do it at a low cost. If he's wanting something he can just toss to somebody and say, here, run this. But that's my review essentially.